This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
This one has an interesting prelude case that I had thrown in here. Did you see the Florida case, the December 2nd article?
About new fingerprint technology?
Yeah, that was the one that I was like, anytime they say there's something new, I look at it and I'm like, wait a second.
What do you mean there's something new?
Like when there's like new technology. At first I thought they were going to say that there's some other way to detect fingerprints. That's not what the article's about. It's a USA Today article from December 2nd.
Another headline skimming fiasco.
Yeah, so if you're skimming the headlines, like it's different. But the headline reads, New fingerprint technology leads to arrest in 1983 Florida cold case murder. Now, this is just an article from December, so technically it's not a Christmas case. But the case is from November 13th, 1983. And so what the article says is Delray Beach, Florida is the log line. Nearly 4 decades after a Florida woman was found beaten to death, her body run over near a Delray Beach train station, city police have arrested a man they believe was responsible for her murder. It's another interesting thing. This is an actual arrest. It's not like we identified him and he's dead, so blah. Law enforcement officers took Ralph Williams into custody in Jacksonville on Monday after a grand jury indicted him in the 1983 murder of Carla Lowe, a 21-year-old woman from southern Florida. The arrest was the first for Delray Beach's cold case unit, which the department formed in January. Investigators said new fingerprint technology led them to Williams, who is believed to have killed Lowe on November 13, 1983, while she waited at an Amtrak train station. This is the exact reason why the cold case position was initiated earlier this year, said Delray Beach Police Chief Javero Sims during a news conference on Tuesday at the department's headquarters. This is to help bring some level of closure to the families who have lost any hope of justice for their losses. That's his words, not mine. There was no apparent connection between Lowe and Williams, and a motive for the murder was not known. Detective Todd Clancy, the leader of Delray Beach's cold case unit, said on Tuesday. Clancy said new technology from a company based in England helped investigators obtain fingerprints from a piece of evidence that was left at the scene. We weren't able to get this fingerprint in the old traditional way that crime scene would get fingerprints. So he's basically saying when the crime scene unit would go out to get fingerprints, they couldn't get it. But this way, there's a new process out there by the Foster and Freeman Company based out of the UK. They have a new machine out there and it's able to get a fingerprint. Detectives did not elaborate on where the fingerprint was found, saying the investigation remains open. As Clancy and current and former Delray Beach investigators spoke, members of Lowe's family watched nearby. They did not speak at the news conference and left without taking questions. Jackie Lowe Rapaz, Carla's sister, later released a statement through the police. I just want the world to know that Carla was a good person. She was a beautiful and giving person. She wasn't just a piece of trash that someone threw away. On a reaction to Williams' arrest, I played this in my head 1,000 times. I never thought this day would come. There's a name now to who did this to my sister. Williams, a former South Florida resident now living in Jacksonville, was taken into custody with the assistance of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. On Tuesday, he remained in custody in Duval County while awaiting extradition to Palm Beach County. So this is an interesting case because it's saying, they've got a machine that can basically assist them with seeing fingerprints in places they couldn't see them before, if that makes sense.
So all of this is confusing to me because we may have talked about this. I don't know if we were recording or not, but it's just come out, and I can't remember where, but it was a source that I felt like was credible that for the most part, fingerprint matching is an opinionated science at this point. And so that's really interesting that they found I assume they were able to they had evidence that the typical like brush and powder didn't pick up. And so I assume they use the fuming or
That's what I
something.
looked. So I looked up to see if I could like track down what they were talking about. This is called latent finger mark technology. That's like that's what Foster and Freeman Company is sort of being known for right now. And when I looked it up, it's a cutting edge technology that uses an innovative chemical process to develop fingerprints on a range of difficult surfaces, including those that have been exposed to extreme heat. So the big example that they use, if you look this up, is discharged bullet cases. So bullet cases that are coming out of a gun that have been fired. So when they come out, the blast and the heat from the weapon being fired typically makes bullet casings pretty useless as far as getting a good print unless it's been touched after the fact.
Right, and that typically wouldn't happen. It would be fingerprints from putting the bullets in the guns.
Right.
Well, and so it doesn't mention in the article, and they go on to not really address questions, and it doesn't say like how they match the fingerprint, right? But they do say that, I think they said that there wasn't a connection previously that they were aware of.
Between them, right.
Okay, and so I'm just curious about, I don't know that much about fingerprinting, but I do know that at some point in time, I've seen something where they would use vapors to somehow, like, I guess the particles are lighter in weight, and so they're able to pick up on things that, the fingerprint powder couldn't get or whatever. And so I know that technology is there, and I guess the particular place you were talking about has funneled it into something that investigators can use. You said it was a machine. And so, it's just like with the whole rapid DNA thing, they've just basically it's interesting that they continued on with fingerprints. So they got their hands on it. And so they found, now she wasn't shot. So I don't know that, well, actually, we don't really know. It just said she'd been run over, right?
Right.
So there's no telling. It doesn't say that it just has to be things that have been heated up, but it's a relevant thing to crime scenes because of, like what you described, the fingerprints getting annihilated going through the weapon when the bullet goes through. And then all of a sudden, if you could retrieve those, that makes a huge difference. So I'm interested to know if his fingerprints were like on file from a former arrest.
Okay, so I have a little bit of information about Mr. Ralph, if you want to know. So I did go hunting for him. So the day that her body was found, he was arrested on grand theft auto and burglary charges.
The same day?
Same day in Delray Beach. Now, his criminal record, he has about 30 arrests for felonies across Florida. He has a lot of burglary arrests. He had a resisting an officer with violence. He threw a punch. He had a couple of counts of robbery with a deadly weapon. I assume a couple of those, they appear to be armed robbery charges reflecting use of a firearm. He's got charges for possession of burglary tools, selling, manufacturing, delivery of heroin and marijuana. So he's got a lengthy criminal record. When I look at this guy, like, yeah, he looks good for something. And like you said, basically this young woman has been reported as being run over. So because she was reported as being run over, there's not a lot of extra information. I want her case to be closed. I want her family to have some measure of justice. But the new technology is honestly what drew me to this, because primarily what Foster and Freeman is doing is what I described. Like, it's mainly being used for gun cases. So this is not like when they say it's a new technology, it's old enough that, like, I found an article about it from 2015 that they were developing it, 2017 that they were putting it out there, in 2019 that people were investigators were cautiously optimistic about the ability to pull fingerprints from shell casing. That's the main thing that drew me to this, and it's the main thing that they sort of hung their hat on here.
I just wonder how reliable it is. That is very coincidental that he was arrested that first day, the same day that she was found. So I wonder if he was suspected all along, maybe, but they didn't have any evidence.
I don't know the answer to that yet. They haven't released that, but he was 59 years old when he was arrested. He's in 1983, he's only going to be, here we go doing math again.
38 years ago.
Right. So he's
21.
He's going to be 21 years old. He's going to be the same age as her.
Right.
And I understand they're saying like they're not related or whatever, but like a 21-year-old running over another 21-year-old, it's bound to have a more interesting story to it, don't you think?
I have no idea. I don't know anything about this case. It's sad. It's very sad. And I'm just really surprised, I guess, that, it's fingerprinting. You're right. It is. It's really interesting. It sounds like, obviously, you typically don't wait this long to arrest the wrong person.
Yeah.
And so I guess I would just be interested to know a little bit more about sort of how they made that connection and like because they say there was no connection. That doesn't mean he wasn't, a unspoken
person of interest or on the list.
Time.
Yeah.
And so I would just be interested to know. I do think that that's really good that they were able to do that regardless of how everything ends up playing out. But I'm sure more will come out as it continues on, maybe. I mean, it may not, but again, somebody had the foresight to keep something. We don't know what, but they kept something that, all these years later, somebody was able to put it in a machine and wave a wand, and suddenly there's fingerprints that match, a database.
Well, so what's interesting about him is, like I've said over time, I get attached to looking at these serial cases that the cops make up, particularly when it comes to like Florida and Texas. And what was interesting, if we move away from the technology for a second and just look at her, in June of 2009, there was a guy named Bruce Albert Tessier who I think he was 69. But if you go through, I think it's the Sun Sentinel has this article. He was already serving 3 decades in prison for a different murder, by the way, back in 2009. But he ended up getting sentenced to 37 years in prison after pleading guilty to second-degree murder in a September 29th, 1983 death of a waitress named Lynn Julin. She was found strangled in her apartment on Federal Highway over in Lake Worth, Florida. According to a report from the state's attorney's office, Tessier was Julin's neighbor at the time, and in 1983, he was on probation after being convicted of sexual battery. Tessier was charged in Julin's death in April after DNA evidence found on her nightgown linked Tessier to the 25-year-old cold case. Now, this is all happening in 2009 when I'm saying this. Julin's family members reached, after Tessier's arrest, they had suspected Tessier since the late 1980s and were happy that he was finally arrested. Tessier was already in prison in Rayford, Florida, when he was charged in Julin's murder. He was sentenced to 33 years in prison in 1992. He had been convicted of killing a woman in Alachua County in Florida. At the time of Julin's slaying in 1983, media outlets and investigators wondered if her death was connected to the slayings of 3 other waitresses. So on that list is Gayla McNeil, 30, of Cocoa Beach. She was found dead near US 441 outside Delray Beach on October 21st, 1983. Elizabeth Ann Huco, 29, of Lake Worth. She was found dead in September in Melbourne, Florida in 1983. And then Carla Lowe is on this list from Pompano Beach, who was found dead in the middle of Depot Avenue in Delray Beach on November 13th, 1983. So after Tessier's arrest, both Palm Beach County sheriff's officials and Delray Beach police said they didn't have any evidence that Tessier was involved in the other 3 murders. And it seems like that was accurate information, because now we're starting to see that if there's a different arrest here for whatever reason, my guess would almost be maybe this was a carjacking, and that's where the fingerprints on a bullet case would come in. You think, or no?
I don't know. I don't know that.
Not carjacking her, but like she was in the way of a carjacking.
Yeah, I don't know. So she was beaten and run over. That's what it says. And it's confusing because they talk about the train, and it seems like initially she got run over by a train, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like she was just run over, and that would be by like an automobile, right? It's saying that she was near the train station. It makes it, at least I initially thought she had been like hit by a train or run over by a train, but that doesn't seem to be what's happening. It seems that she was just run over by an automobile of some sort. And so that it's interesting. I mean, it doesn't say anything about her getting her car stolen, but it seems to me like beating someone and then running over them with a car. I mean, there's definitely some sort of confrontation happening.
Yeah.
That didn't end well.
there are a lot of unsolved cases from that time that have interesting. When I say that time, I mean mid to late 70s through the middle part of the 80s in Florida. There's a lot of unsolved cases down and around that area, or just in Florida in general. Like there's a huge swath of like cases that don't make a lot of sense. I'll see something where I know they know something about the case, because they'll say, "Oh, this was probably drug related," or they'll withhold like a unique cause of death. But anyways, this one appears to be like on its way to possibly getting some kind of justice. I think that would be really cool if that happened. But technically, I guess this is not the episode focus. So we're on, I don't know, day 5, day 6 of doing 12 episodes of Christmas.
Right. And each episode we do a current story too.
Yeah, we were just sort of talking about a current story here. But this one, okay, this is like one of those that has some interesting elements to it, but it's old. Did you catch how old this one was?
Yeah, it's really old.
Yeah, and this is so we're going from Florida over to this will be Kentucky.
Ashland, Kentucky. Yeah.
Ashland, Kentucky. And when I think
the year's 1881.
Yeah, the year's 1881. And this is a triple murder. That threw me off at first. I thought it was grabbing the murder of Emma Carlco, but it turns out that it was not just Emma. And a lot of people don't talk about this one anymore. I know like it gets briefly mentioned here and there on people's blogs and video stuff. And I think someone was doing possibly a podcast episode, but I did not hear anyone else's podcast episode on this. I was attracted to this one because of the lynching that takes place in the middle of it.
It's something. I mean, the whole case is crazy.
Yeah. So on the night before Christmas Eve of 1881, a young girl named Emma Carrico was staying alone at a house while her mother she wasn't house sitting. She was alone, but she was later joined by a woman named Fanny Gibbons, whose mother Martha was away for the night, and Fanny Gibbons' brother Robbie Gibbons. Sometime before dawn on Christmas Eve, so the very early morning hours on the 24th, the Gibbons home caught fire. And when townspeople came to the rescue to try and to put the fire out, they found 3 dead bodies, but they weren't dead from the fire. All of them had been brutally murdered, and the 2 young girls, Fanny and Emma, had been sexually assaulted. This came to be known as the Ashland tragedy, and it had a huge effect on the town of Ashland. The first big thing was they were beaten to death with axes, like the heads of axes. Emma's mother was home, and she was the one who sounded the alarm after the murderers set the house on fire. But neighbors found the 3 bodies inside. Now, they got a confession pretty quickly to this from a man named George Ellis, who was a bricklayer. He implicated 2 co-workers, William Neal and Ellis Craft, and they were all taken to the Catlettsburg jail. Catlettsburg is the county seat of Boyd County. And, for people who are interested in things like this, Catlettsburg in the 2010 census had a population of 1,800 people. So it's very small. But the reason they were taken to the Catlettsburg jail is because they were pretty sure that in Ashland, which has a larger population of about 22,000 people in the same census, still in Boyd County, they were pretty sure that the townspeople of Ashland were going to lynch the 3 for the killing of these 3 teenagers. They were returned for trial on January 16th of 1882. Neal and Craft were convicted in a 10-day trial and sentenced to death, and they appealed the verdict. Ellis was tried later on May 30th. He was convicted and given a life term. But the night that he was convicted, a lynch mob did show up, and they removed him from jail, and they lynched him right there in Ashland. Craft and Neal were found guilty after appealing in separate trials in Grayson, Kentucky, which is it's about 20 miles west of Ashland. It's a very small town of about 4,000 people. Craft was hanged on October 12th of 1883, and Neal was hanged on March 27th of 1885. The descriptions of the victims of the Ashland tragedy, they describe them in a song, actually, which is a pretty popular thing for this time period, for people to sort of make these morbid ballads. Fanny Gibbons was part of a well-known family in the area. She was called a handsome girl with a cheerful disposition and winning manners, who had many friends. Robert Gibbons was her brother. He had lost a leg when he had accidentally fallen under a car that was being pushed along the tracks at the Norton Iron Works. And Emma Carrico, or Emma Thomas, was a well-developed, fine-looking girl who was loved by all who knew her. One of the members of the grand jury for the trial at Neal and Craft's trial, not Ellis's trial, was a young man named Richard Adams. And Richard Adams and his brother Elijah get brought into this story, and they sort of become inextricably tied to it. On the website, easternkentuckygenealogy.blogspot.com, in 2010, there's an article about Richard and Elijah Adams being part of local history. This information was all compiled by Teresa Martin Kleiber from the website there. And here's how that reads. Over the past several years, the Adams family has crossed my desk involved in different venues more than a few times. Richard and Elijah Adams were sons of Pleasant Adams, who lived from 1803 to 1884 and died in Carter County, Kentucky. Pleasant had a total of 16 children and many descendants. At least 14 of them were alive and able to attend his funeral along with their families. Richard Adams was born January 3rd of 1829 in what was then Lawrence County, Kentucky. He married Sarah Elizabeth DeVore on the 1st of July in 1855 in Carter County, and they settled in Flatwoods over in Grinnell County, which later became Boyd County in 1860. Caught in the swirl of the Civil War, trying to establish a living farming, Richard Adams became indebted to William Baldwin. In a petition of equity filed in Greenup County, Kentucky, one Alfred Hastings had been granted a judgment against Baldwin. In order to avoid sale of Baldwin's property, the sheriff made arrangements for a settlement. The problem was that William Baldwin had been within the lines of the rebel government voluntarily for some time. Thus, the county turned to Adams, who was indebted to Baldwin, to meet the judgment of Hastings. No further action seemed to have occurred, and Richard settled into a life there in Flatwoods, in what was now Boyd County. Richard's half-brother Elijah was only 13 years old. He was born January 26, 1849, and he still lived in Carter County during the court battle. Elijah would grow up and stay in Carter County for many years. He was residing with his father, Pleasant, in 1880, but we can assume that the family communicated with Richard Adams' family. After Richard's wife died in 1871, he had married Margaret Crooks, and the family then resided in Upper Ashland. Much has been written about the murder of the Gibbons children in Ashland, Kentucky on Christmas Eve of 1881. It would later become known nationally as the Ashland tragedy. 3 men were arrested. The accused, Ellis, Neal, and Kraft, were transported to Maysville. On the 11th of January, they were returned to Ashland, where a grand jury had already been appointed. Among the 16 on the grand jury sat Richard Adams. The jury sat for 5 long days before returning an indictment for conspiracy and murder on Neal and Kraft. The grand jury was dismissed, and another one was appointed for Ellis a week later. The newspapers went wild, and the residents far and wide talked and were enraged. Without a doubt, the Adams family had much to talk about. Ellis was lynched, and as time moved forward, the National Guard came from Louisville to Catlettsburg to protect Kraft and Neal. There was a change of venue to Carter County, which upset the people more. There was a delay, and the prisoners were to be taken to Lexington for their own protection. The people were furious. The steamboat Granite State, commanded by Captain William Kirker, would take the prisoners and National Guard on their journey on the 1st of November of 1882. A train arrived in Catlettsburg bearing 200 men and boys from Ashland, some with old shotguns and pistols. They demanded the surrender of the prisoners and were refused. The guard dragged a cannon on board and started downriver. It is said that a telegram notified Ashland that the Granite State had left and would soon be passing Ashland. Citizens gathered on Front Street and along the bank of the Ohio River. Among those watching was Richard Adams. Richard gave his testimony of what he saw that day on November 16, 1882, in the Ashland Daily newspaper. A number, perhaps 25 or 30, went on the ferry boat, but some 10 or 15 came back off the boat before she pushed off. The ferry boat pushed out, but she did not go very fast. The steamer whistled. I saw no signal from the ferry boat. I was on an elevated place and could see both boats. I was not excited. The steamer had almost passed the ferry boat, which ran at a piece with the bow down the river. The boats were 150 to 260 yards apart. I heard 2 or 3 reports of small guns, then a volley from the steamer, which drove everything from the bow of the ferry boat back. And for a while, the smoke was so thick that I could not see the ferry boat. And the next volley, fired by the military, was on the people standing where Colonel Ruppert was killed. I got down on my knees in the ditch, and as I raised up, another volley was fired. I then heard someone say that there was a man dead. I saw Mrs. Serre after she was wounded. I did not see Colonel Ruppert after the second volley was fired. Half the ball seemed to strike the bow of the ferry boat. When the smoke cleared, 21 people had either died or were injured. Colonel Lewis Ruppert, who Richard Adams spoke of, was shot through the heart and died that day. He was buried in Ashland Cemetery. Mrs. Jackson Serre was shot in the shoulder and breast and struggled with her wounds for some time. So some of the questions that she raises in this blog post was Elijah Adams in Ashland when those awful events happened? He certainly had some first-hand information from his brother, but Elijah Adams has been credited with writing what is probably the first version of the ballad, The Ashland Tragedy. The ballad does not include the story of the fateful day with the Granite State. Ballad historians continue to debate who wrote what, and one story says that Elijah got his story from James Hunter, who was a resident of Ashland. And the blogger found James Hunter residing in Carter County, but said that it was more likely that Elijah Adams got most of his information from Richard Adams, his own brother. At least one account states that Elijah Adams was sometimes called Professor Adams, stating that he had taught school in his day. Census records showed him as a farmer and even a grocery store salesman, but if he taught school other than music, a record could not be located as of this writing. Elijah Adams would become well known for yet another tragic ballad and story. In 1892, Lottie Yates was murdered in Carter County by her estranged husband, Austin Porter. Yet another mob scene in eastern Kentucky ensued, and Porter was hung from a bridge. Elijah Adams wrote the Ballad of Lottie Yates. And when Elijah Adams died on the 11th of January, 1916 in Mason County, which is in West Virginia, his talent for music was finally acknowledged on his death certificate with a simple entry under occupation as a music teacher. Elijah's brother, Richard, lived for a little over 2 more years and died on the 8th of April of 1918 at Oakview in Ashland in Boyd County, Kentucky. I just think it's interesting when all of these stories are so intertwined like this.
And I guess there was never any question that the men that confessed actually committed the crimes, right? Well, it doesn't even say how old the victims are, except that they were teenagers. That's all it says.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
I found different birthdays and there's math that can be done here, but
sounds like it really was a huge spectacle. And
that's a lot of stuff to happen in a town that didn't have that many people.
Well, it is. And it sort of makes more sense now because the Ashland tragedy is actually like the entire event, including the attempt to lynch.
Well, they lynched George Ellis. They do lynch him.
No, the attempt to lynch the 2 other guys when 21 other people were either injured or killed. And so from there, it seems, obviously now we have to consider the fact how far, we're 140 years later. We're 140 years past this.
Yeah.
But so you have to think about how it reflects the justice system working, because you've got a clearly terrible situation happening with these children being killed. And the man that was convicted and sentenced to life was lynched to death. And the 2 that were sentenced to death, the town didn't want to wait for the justice, right?
Right.
But anytime you're doing something, we talked about, of course, it wasn't murder, but we talked about the guys that were chasing predators.
Right.
Remember? Yeah. Okay. And so, the
modern day lynchers.
Well, in a way, yeah. And so I think when we were talking about that, we were saying you've always got to check yourself and say well, is what I'm doing accomplishing what I want it to do? And I would have to say that a group of a town's group wanting to get justice for 3 teenagers, in the course of which, the guys are going to be hanged anyway. And I assume everybody would know that because they were tried and they were sentenced. And then they appealed and the appeal was upheld. In a situation where you just want to speed it up or have the vindictive part of it, I guess, it seems to me like losing 21 people or having 21 people hurt or injured, it completely defeats the purpose of what they're trying to accomplish. And like I said, it was 140 years ago, but it's an interesting thought that, it just enraged everybody so much that they just weren't thinking clearly, I guess.
No, they they weren't thinking clearly. They were just thinking about avenging these children.
You have to wonder what the motivation for killing those kids was.
So I went back and I found this writing by a guy named J.M. Huff. So it's an interesting sort of backstory to all of this. The way he tells the story, Mrs. Gibbons, who is the mom of the sister and brother, and her youngest son had gone to Ironton, and they had gone for the night. They were going to spend the night with her other older daughter who was married. She made arrangements with Mrs. Thomas, the neighbor, for Emma to stay with Fanny and Robert. So you've got Fanny Gibbons is some kind of teenager, old enough to stay home alone. So Mrs. Thomas is the one who sees that the house is on fire. She thought that the window blind had caught fire. Anyways, this story is really fascinating because it's from J.M. Huff. They formed a committee And money was raised to pay investigators to solve this. And he was a secretary on that committee, so he was like writing from inside the View. And 1881 is so different. You don't have a cop on every corner. So George Gibbons, who was the father of the Gibbons kids, they actually made him the first suspect. They couldn't account for him, and they didn't know what had happened to Mrs. Gibbons and her youngest son, Sterling, at the time that everything had happened. So it turns out she was visiting the older married daughter, and he was in West Virginia, but he had been there since like the 16th. He had been working. They actually brought a U.S. Marshal in from Maysville to go find him. The Marshal goes and gets George Gibbons and this guy, Andrew Hager, who was Gibbons' alibi, essentially, because Gibbons had been living with him doing whatever job he was doing. And Hager testified on Gibbons' behalf, saying that he had in fact been staying in his home since the 16th of December, so a full week, that he had seen him every single day, and that they realized his residence was too far out for anyone to go from where Hager lived in West Virginia, catch a train to Ashland, and back in less than a day. It was basically the first person they brought back to face everything was George Gibbons, the dad of the kids. So he's coming home, he's finding out these terrible things have happened to his children, and they basically think that he did it.
But that's just investigation 101, really.
Yeah, they were just starting there. So on January 2nd of 1882, Marshal Heflin took George Ellis in because the committee had noted that people described his behavior as suspicious. He apparently was able to, like, once he was brought in and interrogated, he basically laid out everything they had done. He stated on the record that Ellis said that Kraft and Neal had threatened him to come to the Gibbons home that night. Kraft said that Ellis and Neal had been talking about having sex with Fanny and Emma. So they demanded that he come act as a lookout that night and then to set the bodies on fire. George Ellis ends up admitting to holding the girls down and setting the fire, but said that he didn't have a choice because William Neal and Ellis Kraft were going to kill him. Kraft and Neal get brought in, and the account that is given by George Ellis is repeated twice in front of each of those men and the committee. Then George Ellis tries to recant his statement after he spent a night in jail with Neal and Kraft, but I mean, essentially that's probably because they were threatening him the whole time. The whole town of Ashland shuts down and everybody goes to the trial. So when you talk about, like, was there, justice in this case or records in this case or whatever, the answer is J.M. Huff's writing, one of the secretaries on the committee, is really the only thing we have. And it's more like a diary. It's written with blurbs. And it basically goes from when the incident happens on December 1881, he wrote up a few paragraphs, and he continues until October of 1882 when the confrontation occurs on the river. This is such a weird case. And it's, like you said, it's 140 years ago. There's really nothing that we can do about it. I was able to find photographs of his book, very old. And I even found an old newspaper article that has sort of been attached to this at this point online, but it's called Ellis Kraft's Two Grades. It doesn't state where it came from. It just says that it's a news article about it. The subtitle to the title, Ellis Kraft's Two Graves, is "A Man Objects to His Being Buried Upon His Land." And this is in Catlettsburg, Kentucky. It just says October the 19th, so I assume it's that year. Ellis Kraft was hanged in Grayson last Friday, was the first man, probably for whom two graves were ever dug. At his mother's request, the first grave was dug near McCormick Schoolhouse, some 8 miles from here. Just as this was finished, however, and all was ready for the interment, the owner of the property suddenly objected, and Kraft's family and friends carried the remains 6 miles further away and waited until another grave could be dug in an open field on the premises of Colonel John Burns. Hereafter, brief religious services, the body of Ellis Kraft was buried. One of his brothers relates this curious dream he had a few nights since. I dreamt I saw my brother in the heavenly world. He was the central figure of a group and clad in a white raiment. Around him stood the men whom he accused in this life of swearing his life away, with the addition of the son of a certain rich man, and he stood with bloody garments just in front of brother Ellis, who was pointing his finger at him. Kraft said he is still convinced that his brother was an innocent man. So even 140 years ago, there were news articles indicating that like there was something amiss here, and whether there was or not, I don't know.
I mean, to me, Christmas or right before Christmas, you have this terrible crime that occurs, and then they go through the motion, and the father is the first suspect, and then it doesn't seem like nobody mentions any of like Emma's father, Emma's stepdad, or anything like that coming into play. So that seemed a little odd to me. And then, so basically, the guy who was acting weird gets hauled in, and he takes on the role of, being there and pointing out two perpetrators. But he takes on the role of, well, I was just there holding them down and then I burnt them, or, he downplays his role. It sounds like sort of a classic coerced confession, doesn't it?
It really does. There's a lot of things about this. If you go through and read the accounts of how the confessions were obtained before the committee and in the jail, even by Marshall Heflin, the accounts very much would not hold up in court today.
Well, I did see where it was alleged, and I don't know by whom or to whom really, but I did see that Neal, the suspect, William Neal, his coat was found at the scene of the crime.
Right.
And so that's physical evidence that, obviously it was a coat and it had some sort of blood on it. And I guess if there was enough to corroborate the fact that it was William's coat and it was clearly involved in the situation, that substantiates the claim, right? But other than that, which obviously that type of evidence would be quickly either confirmed or found to not be relevant now, right? Because they could test to see if it's his coat and, if it's the victim's blood and all kinds of things. But there's nothing indicating that. I mean, obviously they didn't test for DNA in 1882. So that's kind of, that's something at least, but it seems to me like a lot of this could be sort of straight up the police working to just get it solved, to restore some sort of order to the town. Basically.
So I was able to find, hunting through old genealogy sites, I was able to find where people put the statements online or transcribed versions of them. Do you want to hear one of them?
Well, sure.
Okay, so this is when the committee has decided that George Ellis is going to be the star witness, and this happened so fast that it's not even on pace with the court system of today. So George Ellis is in jail in Lexington. He keeps making statements. He is forced by George Heflin, to some degree, to come clean on all of this, which is what you're talking about, the coercion. On January the 16th, William Neal and Ellis Kraft were brought back to Catlettsburg. Neal gets put on trial first. This is just for the murder of Emma Carrico at first. There was very little evidence produced. One woman said she saw Ellis, Kraft, and Neal the morning of the murder. And there's lots of misspellings in these old accounts. It actually says Ellis, Croft, and Neal. The morning of the murder, a half a mile away from the murder site. Others said that Neal was uneasy following the murders and told him he feared that he would be suspected. J.D. House, the man who helped remove the bodies from the house, said that he saw Neal standing just 50 feet away from the blaze. There was actually no physical evidence presented at all, and the prosecution produced their star witness, which is George Ellis. The defense had hoped that he would be like wild and crazy about all this, but instead he gets up and he gives his testimony. His testimony is, I resided in Ashland since May. I've been engaged as a laborer at Powell and House's brickyard most of that time. I was acquainted with the prisoner Neil, also with Kraft. We three worked together at the brickyard. I did not see either of them during the day of December the 23rd. I saw them later that night. They came to my house and called me. I was in bed. I asked what they wanted. Kraft told me to get up. They wanted to see me. I did so. I put on my clothes and boots and went out to the gate. Kraft said, you must go with us. I asked him where. He said, to the Gibbonses. We're going to have some fun. I told him, no, it was too late. I won't go. They said, I have to go. And Kraft drew his revolver. Neil said, bring him along. And we started. When we got inside the gate at the Gibbons, Kraft picked up an axe and Neil got a crowbar from under the porch floor. Kraft pried open the window and Neil was the first to go in. Kraft next. I did not want to go in, but Kraft drew his revolver and said, come in. So I did so. They took the axe and the crowbar in the house with them. We passed through the front room to the second room to the middle room where the girls and Robbie were asleep. Kraft and Neil went to the bed where the girls were. Kraft took hold of Fanny Gibbons, and Neil took hold of Emma. They stifled the girls by putting their hands over their mouths and choking them. The noise awakened Robbie, who was sleeping on a lounge in the same room. Kraft, who had choked Fanny near to death, left her, struck Robbie in the head with the axe, and killed him. He then returned to the bed. Neil dragged Emma off of the bed onto the floor, and Kraft ordered me to hold her until Neil accomplished his purpose, which I did. After Neil let her up, she began to raise up, and crying, she said she was going home to tell her mother. Neil said, I guess not. Struck her on the head with a crowbar, and she fell back on the floor. She was dead. Kraft ordered me to come and help him. I went to the bed. I put my hand on Miss Gibbons' shoulder, and Kraft outraged her, whatever that means, after which he got the axe and killed her. I think he's describing sexual assault there, but I'm not 100% sure. Kraft then said to me, you've done none of the killing, but you must have a hand in it, and ordered me to get the coal oil and pour it over the body of the girls. I did. Kraft set them on fire, and we left the house. When we got out, we separated. I going home. I don't know where they went. I got home about 3:30 and asked my wife to make breakfast. I lay down but did not go to sleep. I heard the cry of fire about 5:30 when I was at breakfast. I went to the burning house but did not stay long. On the following Sunday morning, when Kraft and I met at the place where the house was burned, and Kraft asked me to take a walk. We went out towards the cemetery and began to talk about the affair and said it must be kept quiet. We met Neil and we all talked about it. They wanted me to sign a pledge never to tell about it. I told them I would think about it. They told me I better do better than that. And if I did not do so, the next Saturday night they'd put an end to me. We separated and I went home and Kraft and Neil went away together. So there's that statement. George Ellis confesses and recants at least 7 times throughout this. He made a statement to a Cincinnati newspaper in February of 1882 in which he said that this is George Ellis supposedly saying this to the newspaper, and 2 Negroes he hired committed the murders. He alone raped and killed the girls while his accomplices held them down. He said they crept away from the Gibbons home. They saw Kraft and Neil walking along the street and decided to put the blame on them. But a few days later, he said he never said that. And Ellis ends up getting hanged.
By the lynch mob.
They did, by the lynch mob. But they did, in June of 1882, charge 2 black men by a black detective. They arrest them. They bring them into Catlettsburg for the trial, and they charge them with this crime, with everything we've just been talking about. But at the first hearing for them, the charges get thrown out. And afterwards, outside the courtroom, the detective who had charged them, he ended up getting beaten by another lynch mob who were supporters of the 2 black guys that got charged for no reason. This case drags on and on, but little things like this are why this case drags on.
Wait, so they were arrested for the murders?
They were arrested as being George Ellis's accomplices. And, okay, so what plays out in the meantime is Ellis is found guilty and sentenced to life in prison in June of 1882. That's when the first lynch mob comes out. They drag him out and they end up lynching him. Okay.
Right. Yeah, I got that.
That's George.
Because
Ellis.
he was sentenced to life in prison.
Correct.
The other 2 were sentenced to die.
To death.
Right.
Correct. And you can find pictures of George Ellis's hanging online if you go looking. Then Kraft and Neal get an appeal. They win an appeal. They get a new trial. A lot of people around Ashland thought they were innocent because they got that appeal. And they were basically saying, based on that statement that I read by Ellis, that they didn't believe it was possible that these two did it. So also in June of 1882, they put out a reward that was never paid. And occasionally there would be arrests from this award in 1882. But these two guys end up getting charged like they were the accomplices. Doesn't state anything else about them. It's literally like a 7-line entry that takes place over a month where they're charged. Someone brings them in. They're arrested, and they are going to be tried. But at the first hearing, the charges get thrown out for it all being BS. And then the guy who brought him in, turns out the other lynch mob, who were the supporters of those two guys, decided that they thought he was just trying to collect the reward. It's a crazy story. It keeps going. There's so many little entries about this, but they're not relevant to the case itself. They're just relevant to the process. It's terrible.
Neal and Kraft, it was overturned, and I imagine that did cause a lot of confusion. Recently, we talked about the first forensic genetic genealogy case, the headline skimming that would lead one to believe that that case was overturned. And it seems like from the title, it was based on the genetic genealogy when it was really a juror, right? That was
right. It was a juror who was biased.
Right. And so the reason that Neal and Kraft's their convictions were overturned, but it was based on a technicality in the judge's wording. That is, in the wording in the instructions that he gave to the jury. And then there were issues, and I imagine it was based on the circumstances, because at this point in April, after they were convicted in the fastest trial, like January, right?
Right.
Okay. And so it is overturned, and it has nothing to do with their actual guilt or innocence. It has to do with the appeals court reviewing the trial and reversing the verdicts and sending it back for a new trial. But then the trial wasn't immediately set. So it became a thing where it was up in the air, and everybody was a little bit confused, because unless you read all the opinions and everything, you don't always know why cases get sent back or convictions overturned and people are retried. And if it influences somebody's opinion of guilt or innocence, it can cause a lot of problems, because the whole point of our justice system, you can't be tried twice for something unless the defendant is the one asking for it and hoping for a different result at the end, right? The state can't just charge you over and over again with the same crime and put you through it that way. And I believe I had read somewhere during Neal and Kraft's initial trial, the jury only deliberated for a very short amount of time. I don't know if you saw that. It was like 30 minutes each or something before they decided to sentence them to death. And then it took them like a whole 24 hours to sentence Ellis to life. So they decided really quickly to kill the two guys, but it took them a lot longer to not kill the guy that ended up getting lynched to death. And so, the town just threw the jury's decision right out the window, basically. I do see where that could have caused a lot of problems, because they had been sentenced to, not only were they convicted and sentenced to death, they were sentenced to death in April of that same year. So we're talking just mere months, right? I mean, a very quick turnaround on justice here. But as soon as the Court of Appeals had overturned the verdicts and sent them back, it almost seems like they did a disservice in not immediately at least scheduling it and having it on the trial, because it just sort of went up in the air for a while. And in the meantime, George Ellis was convicted. And
Right.
and then
Lynched.
well, he was convicted and sentenced to life and lynched. And so there was a lot of confusion as far as what was happening, and then the overwhelming just amount of emotion that the entire town was feeling at this happening to these kids. I can see why they were always suspicious of that, them missing their death dates, essentially, the court having overturned their convictions, and then it coming up, so much later, because you're talking about, I believe, in October is when they finally got back around to retrying them.
Yeah.
And then they were immediately hung. Is that correct?
They are, Neil's not hung until March 28th of 1885.
Oh, wow. So no, it was a while.
Kraft, so he was tried again. Kraft gets hung on October 11th, October 12th, 1883. Kraft gets hung.
Okay.
But I understand what you're saying. It's really complicated to read. Did you catch that that they had to declare that one of the judges was Judge George Brown, I believe, and they had to declare that the defense team was his son?
What?
George Brown was the judge proceeding over George Ellis's trial.
Uh-huh.
His son, Thomas Brown,
Was a prosecutor?
was
the defendant.
George Ellis's lawyer.
Well, it doesn't seem like there was any favor given there.
Oh, not at all. It didn't help anything. I was just wondering,
Does that work?
how
Does that
would
work both ways? As far as conflict of interest? Because, I'm sure it does, but I'm just saying, if he had been acquitted, that would be one thing. But I guess a declaration and an agreement that, because, you can stipulate to the fact that there is I don't know. This was, like I said, a long time ago, but you can say that, yes, we acknowledge there's a conflict of interest and we waive it, right?
Yeah, that's what they did. They stipulated to it.
Because it doesn't sound like he was, giving him any favors, since his client was ultimately convicted. So,
well, yeah. Ultimately, crimes like this were very interesting 150 years ago. It's very weird for them to deal with them, and this is sort of our justice system starting to form, if that makes sense.
Well, it sounds like the justice system, our justice system, is rooted way before this ever happened. But it sounds like, for the most part, some things were already in order. they did have a system in place where they could have an appeal.
Okay, but before this, it's not a justice system. It's sort of Wild West. The appeals court, this is going to be some of the first major actions for the appeals court to be dealing with different things related to this. You're right.
What I mean by rooted is, our system of justice, it's derived from several different places, but it was also, a lot of it was happening in England before our country was ever a country.
No, I'm saying this is the physical system starting to take place, where people who are going to influence, these people that are judges and appellate judges in Kentucky are going to influence the justice system for Kentucky all the way to today.
Well, sure.
The decisions they were making back then.
Yeah.
There's a lot less lynching today.
Well, the lynch part of it didn't have anything to do with the justice system.
Yes, it did.
Well,
there was no way for them to stop it.
Well, right. But actually, the lynch mob is the exact opposite of the justice system. Because lynching is what happens without a justice system.
Right. So what I'm saying is we're starting to get away from lynching at this time, and by lynching, I'm saying both ways. The actual lynching of when strangers come in and take a person out, that's a prisoner and a condemned man, or when the justice system convicts somebody on a Friday and hangs them on a Monday morning.
Right. Well, yeah. And so I feel like that it is a good example of it, how it's starting. Yeah.
I do want to end with. Do you have a lot more on this? Or?
No, that's it.
So I want to end with Neil, because of the way things went down. He gets two last words. So on March 3rd of 1885, he thinks he's about to die. He thinks he's put on the train to Grayson, and he thinks that he's going on to the gallows. So he makes a short speech to all the people that show up and says, "Farewell, good people. I hope to meet you in heaven. I am persecuted to my death by Campbell and Redland, who persecuted themselves and bulldozed that lunatic George Ellis into swearing lies against me. It's a fearful thing to walk upon the gallows and die for a crime I did not commit. Bear in mind that I will be proved innocent of this charge, just as I now am innocent. I have to be dragged back and hung like a dog for what I didn't do. I thank the citizens of Mount Sterling for their kindness to me. I hope to meet you in a better land." So that's his last statement. But then the execution gets postponed and he gets returned to Mount Sterling. And he's brought out again on March the 28th of 1885. When he's finally on the scaffolding, he says, "My friends, I say to one and all, you know this is no place to tell a lie. I stand here today to suffer for a heinous crime I did not commit. One day my innocence will be established beyond a doubt. I bid you one and all goodbye. O Lord, thou knowest I am innocent. Into thy hands I commit my soul. I am innocent." And the last words were said just as the drop fell out from underneath him. 10 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. None of his relatives were present, but his body was claimed, and he was buried on a hill back of his father-in-law's place near Catlettsburg. This case comes up from time to time, but nobody's ever solved it if they didn't do it.
I was going to say, I hope that he got his, rendering of innocence from somewhere else, because it certainly has not occurred here on Earth. I don't know if, because he says one day I'm going to be found innocent, and I hope he was talking about his final judgment day, because nobody continued looking here. I mean...
Well, this case comes up from time to time, and people write about it. It doesn't get written as much about today as it used to. Some people do some podcast stuff and videos about it. There's not a lot of media available, so it's kind of a boring case to do that way.
Well, there's actually nothing available, because I still don't even know how old the victims were, and it's that sort of lacking that makes it so. You're right, it doesn't have media coverage, but not just media coverage. It lacks some bare bone type things we need for cases. I have to tell you though, just based on the little tiny bit that we've looked at, I don't know that these guys actually did anything. Because just like we were talking about how our justice system is beginning to form here in this, as we kind of go through this series of events here. So that's where they were at, right? So it's like an attempt at justice that gets thwarted by a lynch mob with one of the three defendants. And then they have to go way out of their way to keep it from happening to the other two defendants. And then in the meantime, you got 21, bystanders, or I guess they were probably participants, but, they get hurt or injured in the meantime. So that's where we're at justice system wise. And yet they solved this crime in less than a month.
Okay, it's funny that you bring that up, because I went on this old website called RootsWeb. You ever use RootsWeb?
I've been on it before, yeah.
Okay, so they have an article under their journals about this. It's identified as Kentucky Carter, like the state and the county is the name of the journal. And then the entry for this was the Neil Kraft murder. So I almost didn't find it when I went looking, but I thought the last paragraph of it's one of our sources for this episode, but the last paragraph really stood out to me. The scale of justice is rarely tilted far to one side. The truth of what happened that night in 1881 will never be known. And up until the time of the brutal murder, all three of the accused men had seemingly lived normal lives with no hint in their background to suggest that they had in them such savagery. The odds that all three would expose that repressed side of their personality at the same time seems remote. Nevertheless, not just one, but several juries voted the same way, guilty as charged. Surely they could not all be wrong, or could they? One of the detectives who last worked on the case but was not called to testify made a simple and thought-provoking observation. How would Ellis, Kraft, and Neal know that the children were home alone that night? Only 3 people knew that the children were alone: Mrs. Gibbons, her son Sterling, and Mrs. Thomas. All that is certain is that after all was said and done, a dozen or so people died, a similar number were seriously wounded, and many lives were forever upended. The case would be debated for years after, and even an occasional arrest was made, until finally it was quietly nudged aside.
I agree with that sentiment entirely. Not that, I mean, and not because I think that justice was served. I just don't think it's possible at this point in time. But that's exactly what I was thinking. How did those guys know that they were home alone?
Yeah.
And there is one specific suspect that is like painfully lacking here. And that would be Emma's father or stepfather or what have you. I don't.
Yeah, he's not mentioned at all.
Right. And it's possible he was dead. I don't know if she's got 2 last names. And I believe Thomas was attributed to her stepfather.
Right.
So, I don't know. They don't mention it. It doesn't come up. But it's very convenient under the circumstances. Now, it is possible, I imagine, so to play the other side of that, if they knew that the father was out of town.
Maybe they had ruled out the other.
Well, they could have just said, well, it doesn't matter if the mom and the other brother are home because they're just collateral damage. The fact that Emma was over there wasn't known if it was, in fact, the guys that did it. But, to go through something like heinous like that, like, especially when you've got the person who's like the least involved confessing and blaming other people, that is the weirdest scenario to me.
Well, it resulted in 3 hangings.
Right. And it also sort of resulted in a case being closed. I guess to weigh it out, you'd have to decide. I mean, because what would have happened if they hadn't have found somebody?
I always wonder, like, in cases like this, like, so it's 140 years old. Do you think they kept anything that would be of any kind of evidentiary value, even by mistake?
I don't even think they had it to begin with.
They didn't collect it. They just made their observations and moved on.
I hate to say that, but yeah, I think the only reason that George Ellis ended up, sitting in the interview room is because too many people saw him acting weird. I mean, well, what was your thought on it? I mean, because I don't even see like the connection being made except for the fact that he was acting weird.
This is a sham to me. Like the whole thing. Yeah. I don't have any, like, it's not that I'm not trying to bail on it one way or the other. I'm just saying, like, I can't make hide nor hair of what they're saying. When I go through what is left for us to look at, it's not impressive. Like, there's no investigation here that like makes me go, oh, this happened or this didn't happen. Like, there's not. That's why I was asking if you thought there was anything of evidentiary value left behind.
No, I don't think there was anything of evidentiary value to begin with.
But I'm saying, like, if you like dug up the bodies in this case, do you think they're wearing something fancy dress, or they're wearing what they wore that night?
I don't know. I don't know how badly the bodies were burnt.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So this case truly becomes a case.
The other thing is, like, that seems, okay, burning a body to cover up a crime, I guess could be a motive even back in 1881. Nowadays, a lot of times burning a body or an attempt to burn a body or a crime scene, it's done more to destroy forensic evidence, right? And so that even seems like a little wild to me.
Yeah, it is kind of weird. I don't have an answer for any of that. I was just curious.
I don't know. Did you see where like these people actually existed or anything?
What do you mean?
The victims specifically? Because
I found like a lot of information about this that I've shared with you here, but if you're asking, do I have their birth certificates? The answer is no, I do not.
No. Well, and I'm not doubting that something occurred, right? I don't doubt that. It's just, it really bothers me. I feel like age would be a really relevant factor here, and like nothing and I haven't gone like
the lack of birth dates and stuff,
or just saying how old they were. I haven't found
that
anywhere.
Important back then,
but
I don't know.
Actually, well, maybe it wasn't, but one of the very first things you see in just about every article is the person's name, comma, how old they were in
modern times.
Sure. And I haven't looked at vital records to find birth certificates or anything like that, because I probably will now that we've talked about it, but I'm just curious because of like the whole way everything sort of, it almost sounds like somebody put a spin on a story, like, so from modern times. I don't imagine, I guess maybe to cover up the crime that they committed, but there would have been no reason for them to be worried about potential forensic evidence being discovered, because they didn't even know that was a thing.
Well, so, and this is how I will wrap this up. I did go deep enough to find their graves.
Okay.
So Emma Carrico, or Emma Thomas, was 14 years old. She was born in 1867, 1881. But that made me more dubious because it said that she was born on December 23rd, 1867, and died on December 23rd, 1881. But her family left her home alone for the birthday.
No. She was the one who came over. The Gibbons were left home alone. Emma's mom was at home.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry.
And so here's the thing, though. I have a feeling the Gibbons kids were younger than her.
Well, I'm gonna give you that one too.
Because otherwise, she was there to keep them company. It's just it's a weird situation.
So Fanny Gibbons was born on November 22nd, 1867. So she was also 14 years old. And what?
The brother.
Robert Gibbons was born on May 15th, 1864.
So he was 17. So
yeah.
We got two
14-year-olds and a 17-year-old.
Yep. And this would be so terrible for me to say, but I'm thinking that, I don't even know if you can cut this out if you want. I'm thinking that they probably should have looked a little harder at Emma's mom.
Yeah, but they were raped.
Well, I'm not saying that there wasn't a guy involved.
Oh.
Because she just happened to wake up in the early morning hours and see the house on fire. Not to mention, since she was home, why didn't she invite the kids over?
They had a lot of siblings. William Gibbons, born 1861. Anna Gibbons, 1870. Sterling Gibbons, 1871. Harry Gibbons, born 1874. There was a lot of Gibbons kids.
But there were only the three there that night, right?
Sterling
was with his mother.
There's just the two, Fanny and Robert.
Right. And so why didn't Emma Thomas's mother ask the two kids to come to her house to spend the night?
I do not know the answer to that question.
Because the thought is, well, if there had been an adult home, it probably wouldn't have happened. It just so happened. I don't know how often Mrs. Gibbons was out of town, right? I don't know. But it seems odd that she would send her teenage daughter over to spend the night with someone her own age and an older boy. I just know, like, now in life, if something were to present itself and somebody said, well, can your kid come over because my kids are going to be alone? I would say, well, no, but your kids are more than welcome to come to my house and stay while you're out of town. I'm just saying, it just seems really suspicious to me.
Definitely something. Well, it's sad. I feel bad because I feel like these old cases just never stood a chance. There just wasn't anything where like some form of justice. I think people genuinely believe there was some justice in this case. I do not.
I have had some pretty exciting and then yet like really depressing sort of revelations, not necessarily in cases this old, but like as I've reviewed cases over time, just in like before we were ever even going to talk about them on a podcast, just looking into stuff, I've seen where cases have gone really wrong.
Yeah.
And like they can't get themselves back on track, and they end up just being wrong. It's horrifying to me because I feel like it could happen to anybody at any time, right? And it has huge sort of consequences to being aware of how things like this play out. But I think you're right. I think that a lot of cases, well, of course, they're dependent on how the investigation goes, but I feel like an investigator, just any law enforcement investigator who is persuasive enough to get a confession out of someone could probably get a confession out of anybody, right? And I don't necessarily mean a confession out of the person who did it. But then you have to wonder, a ruthless person who, has committed a violent crime, all of a sudden they just turn into a puddle because an investigator wants them to confess. It's never made a whole lot of sense to me, because it seems like if you're ruthless enough even to go along with a crime, right? Even if you're like in this case, George Ellis saying that he played like just, he was forced to do something. For one thing, I feel like most, and I don't know how old he was, but I feel like most men, especially if they're fathers, they would just say, well, you're just going to have to shoot me, as opposed to me holding down these kids while you attack them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, don't you? That's just my thought on it. So all of a sudden, so it sounds like clearly he didn't have a backbone, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me when you've got investigators who are, they push and they get confessions. Because if you can kill somebody, I feel like you could keep your mouth shut forever about anything you've done.
Unless it's like a snapped. You think those are the guys that talk?
Well,
technically Bundy did. He kept his mouth shut forever.
Well, right. But in the talking that he was doing was self-serving. It wasn't confessional, really. He wanted to give, he was confessing, but he wasn't confessing because somebody was bullying him into confessing. He was confessing because he was trying to save himself. But in a situation like this, where you've got, this guy like confessing and blaming two other people, which is really odd because I don't know. I guess it wasn't part of the Wild West to like the whole, snitches get stitches thing. Because
I think that's been around for a long time, though.
Right. But it seems to me like even if you're going to go down, you don't take everybody down with you. That sounds like a concocted plan. I'm just saying, I know.
A good one, though.
Huh?
Doesn't sound like a plan that makes sense.
It doesn't?
Well, who
it
made
sounds
that
like
plan?
A concocted plan. The investigator made the plan.
Oh, yeah. No, I could see that. Yeah. I thought you meant he was attached to some kind of plan. Well, it's terrible. It failed.
In my opinion, when they got him in there and, got him set up to confess and everything, they realized like nobody's ever going to believe this guy did this. That's why they're like, so which friend, who are you taking down with you? Because even in the case that you get caught, right? At least me personally, I don't commit crimes, especially not violent crimes, but I don't commit any crimes. But I'm most certainly, if I see it going south, I'm not taking anybody with me. Even if I didn't do it, I'm not going to bring others along. You know what I mean?
I follow what you mean, yeah.
To me, this is, it's really sad, and it makes me feel like the roots of what I see in law enforcement have been very prevalent for a long time. And for whatever reason, And there are cases where investigators aren't bullied. They smooth their way into talking with people. And then, like we talked about on Black Friday, we talked about Byron Smith, and we actually got to hear like some of his interrogation or interview. He was in custody, so I guess interrogation. And, he wasn't a cold-blooded killer. I mean, he was losing his mind. And he talks openly. I mean, the guy didn't even have to really press. I mean, the investigator wasn't bullying him at all, right? He was just listening, basically. When you have situations like that, it is all the more why, because in my opinion, Byron Smith needs mental health care.
Yeah, mental health treatment.
And it's almost like diametric opposition that a cold-blooded killer just readily confesses. As far as just listening, unless it's to keep themselves from being put to death because they're the only one who holds the secret to all of their victims, right? That's what Ted Bundy did. But I feel like everybody involved in this particular case 140 years ago, clearly they, they're all dead now. And hopefully they all kind of figured out what was happening.
So weird. All right. Well, I am done with this case. You got anything else on it?
God, no.
Thank you for joining us. We are sponsored by LabRottiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabRottiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.